Hello, welcome to Chapter 18. We're talking today about domestic economic policy and foreign policy. A few things to keep in mind here. As talked before, last chapter, there's a four-step policy-making process. We'll be talking about that again in the context of domestic economic policy and foreign policy. That is, first step, define the issues. What do you need a policy to do? Second, create the policy. Third, implement the policy. Fourth, evaluate the success of that policy. I also talked before about the four types of politics that the Wilson book discusses here: majoritarian, entrepreneurial, client, and interest group. And so keep those in mind as well as we go through this material. 2 points I want to make that are important in Chapter 18 about economic policy. First, the economy and economic policy are two different things, they're distinct things, but they're related phenomena. By economy, we're talking about things like production, consumption, investment, and trade, things that happen both in the private sector, companies, corporations, multinational corporations, domestic corporations, whatever, but also the economy is influenced by public sector things like the post office, like transportation, other kinds of things like that. By economic policy, what we're talking about here is the role played by government in supporting, regulating, and directing economic activity. Remember that in the federal system, we've got national, state, and local governments. All three of these levels also play a role in making of economic policy because they determine things like taxation and expenditures, etc. Second point is that the government has three main ways to influence economic activity or make economic policy. Appropriations is the spending of money by government on certain economic activities like defense, health, education, welfare, pensions, other kinds of things that we want our governments to spend money on to build up the economy, to support us in various kinds of ways. Second way is through taxation. That is, taxation is the method of collecting money to spend on appropriations. That is where governments get their money to spend money on various projects is from taxations from individuals, their income taxes, through corporations' profits, and from tariffs on international trade. Third thing is regulation. These are rules that encourage or deter certain types of economic activity and set conditions on production, consumption, trade, and investment. There's one constant that the book talks about in American politics. According to the book, it says Americans want more spending by their government without having to pay more taxes or without having to support a bigger government. That is, they want less government interference in their business. They want to pay low taxes, but they want the government to spend money on all kinds of projects that they want in favor. The book lists a number of places where Americans think the government should spend more money, such as defense, combating terrorism, policing, but also things like education, on healthcare, on welfare programs, on all kinds of things like that. And so what Americans want is basically everything without having to pay for it. Since 1900, federal expenditure has grown pretty consistently. It's spiked, particularly during World War I and World War II, huge military undertakings. And after both of those wars, the government's budget tended to decline. But after World War II, it never really declined as much as it had after World War I. Since 1950s, the federal budget has consistently grown over the years. Think about this, about 1900, the federal budget consisted of about 3% of the gross domestic product. In that period, it has grown to make up about 20% of the gross domestic product in 2021. Taxes have also increased. Remember that in 1900, there was no federal income tax. That gets initiated with the 16th Amendment in 1913, which created a federal income tax for the first time. Taxes as a percentage of the gross domestic product have increased from about 3% to about 18%. The national debt has also increased, particularly since 1980. Since 1980, over the last 40 years, the federal budget has grown tremendously. It has increased basically every year, nearly every year. And nearly every year of those 41, there has been a budget deficit. That means that the government has committed to spending more money each year than it can bring in the form of taxes, corporate taxes, tariffs, et cetera. And so that means basically what's happening is the federal government is borrowing money to spend on all kinds of projects that people want. That leads us into debt. The national debt is a calculation of basically what the government has spent by running deficits each year and how much that is added up to over time, which is basically how much money do we as a country owe. Think about this. You spend a certain amount of money each month on your budget. If you don't have enough money, but you need to buy more stuff, particularly say this time of year, you might use a credit card, which leads you into debt. If you don't pay off that balance, then that debt continues to accrue from month to month to month. Even if you're just paying off the interest, your debt will continue to grow over time. Well, that's what's happened with national debt. From 1980, the national debt was calculated to be about 908 billion. It has now increased to $28 trillion. That's a 3,100% increase over the last 4 years. The national debt, which is that $28 trillion, which we owe to people, and these are anybody, these are other governments, these are individuals, you own part of the national debt perhaps, et cetera. Basically, the government pays for it by selling bonds to anybody that wants to buy them. And in order to decrease the national debt, the government will have to buy back those bonds. But there's no will to do that. We want to spend more money each year, and we feel like we have to spend more money each year on a variety of projects, everything from defense to education and welfare. And we do it by going into deeper and deeper debt, regardless of the future consequences. So my generation inherited debt from my parents' generation. Your generation will inherit the debt from my generation, and it will just keep growing probably over time. There are 4 economic theories the book talks about that shape the way the federal government makes policy. These are monetarism, Keynesianism or demand side economics, planning, and Reaganomics or supply side economics. Depending on the party affiliation and the inclinations of the president and Congress, they will adopt one or more of these types of policies here. Monetarism is the idea that the federal government can shape the economy by controlling the amount of money in circulation. How does it do that? As the book points out, if the government wants to put more money into circulation, it will buy bonds, savings bonds, federal bonds, government bonds, all kinds of bonds like that. It will buy them back by printing more money, and it buys back those bonds. The more money there is in circulation, prices tend to go up. More money creates inflation. If the inflation rate starts to go up, as it is right now, then the government can actually sell more bonds and take some of that money out of circulation. And less circulation, less money in circulation means that prices start to go down, but also means that there's less spending, so there's less demand on the economy and it shrinks. And so buying bonds can create inflation, selling bonds can create a recession. Keynesianism is based upon the theories of John Maynard Keynes, a British economist at the turn of the 20th century, who argued basically that the way that the federal government can influence the economy is by supporting demand for goods. How do you support the demand for goods? The way he had thought was that you increase the amount of money in the pockets of poor people. By creating programs that support poor people, such as work programs, welfare programs, those kind of things, you're putting money into the pockets of people who need to spend that money. Poor people don't save money, they spend money. They need to buy food, they need to buy clothing, they need to pay their rent, they need to pay off their debts, whatever kinds of things. And so for Keynes, give money to poor people, they will spend it, that will create more demand. More demand means that companies will try to meet that demand by increasing production, hiring more workers, paying better wages, building factories, doing those kind of things. And so for Keynes, the way to build the economy was give money to the bottom of the system, the poor people, pump it in at that level, and that will trickle up to the wealthy who own the companies who have to meet the demand. Planning is the idea that the federal government can actually plan the economy. It can make decisions about where the economy should be in 5 years, 10 years, kind of a thing. This is something that's mostly associated with non-liberal states, that is places like Russia, China, where they have planned economies. What this means is in the American context, let's say that we know that we need to have more electric vehicles on the road in the next 5, 10, 20 years than we have right now. We need to get off of fossil fuels. We need to use more electricity, more renewable energy. How do we go about doing that? Well, One way is you leave it to the market to determine this by just letting gas prices do what they will. And the assumption would be that once gasoline gets too expensive for people to buy, they'll switch over to something more cheap, which would be presumably electric cars. Well, that may or may not happen. Because as long as the price of petroleum is cheap, the price of gasoline is cheap enough, the Americans will keep burning it as much as they can. And so the federal government can get involved in trying to promote electric vehicles by doing things like giving tax cuts to companies that produce electric vehicles, or giving tax incentives to people who buy electric vehicles so that you could deduct the cost of your electric car, we'll say, from your federal income tax each year, something like that. So that's planning. Fourth one is Reaganomics, or supply side economics. This was a way of thinking that developed in the 1970s, developed by people like Milton Friedman and Laffer, two American economists who said that the way to grow the economy was actually support the supply side of things, not the demand side. Reduce taxes on the wealthy, eliminate government spending and regulation, and that will mean there's more money among those who own companies and own factories, things like that. They'll use that extra money to invest in more factories, which will create more supplies of things, which will lower the cost of those, which will increase demand because now the people can buy more stuff more cheaply. Okay, so those are four basic assumptions here. Keynesian economics, or demand side, and Reaganomics are two very different, very opposing kinds of systems. Give money to the poor to support the economy, or you give money to the rich to support the economy. Economic policy is made at numerous levels. At the federal level, it is shared by the executive and legislative branches. The executive branch has a number of offices and advisors that work for the president to help them make decisions about the economy. And three that the book mentions in particular: the Council of Economic Advisors, the Office of Management and Budget, and the Secretary of the Treasury. These are three agencies that report directly to the president, and they have various kinds of things that they advise the president on, including the amount of money, interest rates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's also an independent agency that operates, it's connected with the executive branch, but not controlled by the executive branch, which is the Federal Reserve System, which we'll talk about in a moment. Congress also is involved in this. Remember that Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress the role of appropriation. That is, Congress controls the purse string. The president has no power under the Constitution to spend any money. The president can make policy decisions. The president can decide how money appropriated by Congress is spent to a certain extent, but the president doesn't have a source of money other than what Congress approves. So Congress has to approve every penny that is spent by the federal government. It doesn't generally do it at that kind of level. It comes up with bills that basically spell out that these will be spent, money will be spent on this. Sometimes it gives certain amounts in the billions, trillions these days. Excuse me. Congress has a number of committees that work on the budget full-time. The House and Senate both have budget committees. The House and Senate both have appropriations committees. The House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee are committees that work on how government should support various parts of the economy. Also consider the role of four forces at work in economic policy making. That is, the president himself. The president generally runs every 4 years, promising the American people that they will spend money on certain kinds of things. For Joe Biden, it was the Build Back Better program that was going to create a green economy and give support to the poor and the working class people and working families, and it would tax the rich more. Ronald Reagan or Donald Trump were both supply side economist types who believe that government should be smaller and that there should be tax cuts for wealthy people, that will invest that money in the economy. Public opinion also plays a role in this, i.e. the voters determine these kind of things. Do they vote for Joe Biden? Do they vote for Donald Trump in 2020? That is a decision that reflects people's notions about what the president will give them in terms of benefiting themselves, but also the overall economy. Do they want a more free trade, more Keynesian type, or do they want more things like tariffs and boycotts and things and control on foreign trade, America first, supply side kind of economics? Thirdly, you've got interest groups that are involved in the making of policy. lots of trade groups representing everything from makers of dish detergent and toilet paper to realtors to the defense industries to the fossil fuel industries, to tobacco, gun makers, all kinds of things like that. All these groups that are involved in economic activity have lobbyists who push Congress to spend money to support their particular interests. Trade unions, service unions are also involved in this. All the big unions like the United Auto Workers, the union I'm in, the United University Professions, these are all engaged in trying to get Congress to spend money on the various kind of things they want, on tariffs or on more spending for education, whatever it might be. The AARP is also a major public interest group that is the American Association of Retired People. Now, this is a group made up of people over 55 that spends a lot of time and a lot of money convincing Congress and the president to spend more supporting Social Security and Medicare and other things that are of concern to older people who tend to vote in much larger numbers than younger people do. Also, activists involved in policy making. The role of activists has become increasingly important over the last 20 years, but they go back a long way. The Bonus Army, which was formed during the Great Depression, 1931-32, was a group of World War I veterans that went to Washington to try to convince Congress to pay bonuses that they had been promised for their service in the war, now during the Depression, rather than holding on to them until later on. Share Our Wealth was a plan put forth by Huey Long, a presidential candidate in 1932, or 36 rather, who argued for a program that would give more money to poor people and take money away from the wealthy through taxation. The Battle in Seattle, a group of people who got together in Seattle to challenge the power of the World Trade Organization and call for trade policies that did more to protect the rights of workers and human rights and protect the environment. Or the Occupy Wall Street movement, which were activists demanding more fair tax policies and more taxation of the 1% in order to support programs for working people in the United States. So all of these four are part of the policy-making process. It's a very complicated process. It's going on constantly. Every year, the president submits to Congress a budget, which is basically a list of all the kinds of things the president wants Congress to support. Spells out in rough kind of things the amount of money the president wants spent on each of these policy initiatives, and then Congress has to spend the spring and summer working it out, hashing it out. If you pay attention to the news, you'll hear they're constantly talking about it. The big issue of late has been the Build Back Better bill, which is gone through the House now and is at the Senate. And there's been a lot of wrangling over the size of this and what are the priorities. It started out as about a $3 trillion bill. It's now been cut down to under $1.5 trillion, and it'll probably be down to closer to like $1 trillion by the time it's done. And certain priorities will simply be taken out of the bill and not funded this year by the administration, by the federal government. The Federal Reserve, as I mentioned, is another part of the policy-making process. This was created in 1913, and the idea was that the United States needed an agency that was independent of the executive branch and the Congress that would set financial policy and try to build the economy. And so they created a system that's called the Federal Reserve. It's run by a board of governors. The current chair of the board of governors is Jerome Powell, who was appointed, if I'm not mistaken, by Donald Trump. Biden has suggested that he be continued in his position for another 4 years, the 4-year appointment. The governors are each appointed for 14-year appointments, non-renewable. And so the idea is to have people running the system who are independent of the electoral politics, that are not running for office all the time. They are rather appointed and they have a certain tenure, but the idea is that they don't have lifetime tenure, that they have a certain period in which they can do it. So that means that presidents can from time to time change them. The Federal Reserve is made up of 12 regional banks. They're around various places: Philadelphia, Kansas City, San Francisco, Denver, New York, et cetera. And what these banks do is they control the amount of money in circulation in the economy. Basically, what they do is they buy and sell bonds to decrease or increase inflation. regulate the operations of private banks in the United States. Things like Citibank or Chase or whatever fall under the control of the Federal Reserve System, which determines certain policies about them. The Federal Reserve also sets interest rates. What it does is the Federal Reserve is the source of all money for banks. Banks borrow money from the Federal Reserve for their operations, and the Federal Reserve sets the interest rate. If it wants to stimulate the economy, it will set an interest rate very low. Right now, the interest rate is down around 1% or so, 1-2%. Sometimes it's even below 1%. And that means that more people will borrow. More borrowing means more spending. More spending means more demand. More demand means more growth. If the demand is too high and the economy is growing too fast, that means that inflation will happen. And so the Federal Reserve can withdraw some money and raise interest rates, which will make borrowing more expensive, which will encourage people not to borrow as much, not to spend as much, and therefore demand goes down and inflation goes down. Okay. The federal budget is an annual kind of thing, as I mentioned. The president starts off by, basically what happens is that the president gives a State of the Union address each year in February. And this is the time when the president spells out their priorities for the coming year. And then they send this off to Congress, who then debates about it. Okay, the federal budget is divided into two kinds of things: mandatory spending and discretionary spending. About 2/3 of the budget nowadays is made up of mandatory spending. That is, it is paying off interest on the national debt, and it's paying for what are things that are called entitlements. That is, the programs that people are entitled to, payments from the federal government, things like Social Security, the retirement program, Medicare, a healthcare program for retired people or people over 65, veterans benefits, pensions, healthcare, those kind of things for veterans. These are all requirements that the federal government has undertaken, and it means that the federal government has to pay this money. It doesn't matter how much it costs, it has to pay. So there's no decision-making on that part of the budget. And that's about 2/3 of the federal budget. The federal budget now is around $1.6 trillion. So consider about $1 trillion of what the US government is going to spend in the next year is on these kind of things that are mandatory, the debts that the government has to pay. The other third is what's called discretionary. That is, this is what Congress gets to fight over and decide upon how to spend this discretionary amount. And that is, and so what this is everything is discretionary is defense. So our military is actually discretionary. It's not required by the Constitution or anything like that. Congress gets to decide how much do we spend on the military. Right now, it is around $700 billion, roughly $2 billion a day is what we're spending on our military right now. But also programs like healthcare, the Affordable Care Act, all that kind of stuff is discretionary spending. Education, how much does the federal government spend on supporting primary, secondary, and university education, welfare, food stamps, aid to families with dependent children, various kinds of things like that, and other kinds of projects like the infrastructure, transportation, building bridges, roads, maintaining kinds of things. All that kind of stuff is discretionary spending. And what happens when Congress gets into their fight over the budget, it is the discretionary spending that tends to get cut. Now, some people favor more spending on defense, and so they want to cut the other programs like welfare and education and health spending. Other people prefer the social programs, the welfare programs, and so they say, let's cut spending on our defense program. During the Cold War, that period from 1945 to 1991, defense we're spending more and more and more on it all the time in order to maintain a powerful military. The war on terror that began in 2001 leads to a nearly doubling of the defense budget every year for the last 20 years or so. And so defense has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. If you look at the data on how much the US government spends on things like education, it's a minuscule amount. It's not even 1% of what spends on the defense budget each year. Where do they get the money for this? Revenues is the amount of the money that comes in to pay for these programs, these discretionary and mandatory programs. About 50% of the federal government's wealth income comes from income taxes. That is individual income taxes that we pay when we get a paycheck. Each time you get a paycheck, a little bit of that goes to the federal government and to the state government in terms of what, in the form of income taxes. Those governments then spend those. About 7% of the federal government's revenues come from corporate taxes. That is taxes on companies and their profits. Some people say that that's too high. Some people say that that's much too low. Say that corporations should be paying more in the way of taxes. Think about a company like Amazon, which is a massive corporation making billions of dollars of profits each year, but it pays no federal income taxes. Why not? Because this is one way that the federal government can encourage things like building new companies and through growth of companies, getting them to hire more people, et cetera, is by keeping their taxes low, or so the argument goes. Expenditures. There's a chart in the book that shows what the government spends its money on in terms of the discretionary thing. About 15% of the budget is on defense. About 15% is on non-defense discretionary things like health, education, and welfare. So this is the 30% of that 1/3 of the budget that Congress actually can decide on. Okay, moving to foreign policy here. We've got three main kind of questions we're going to ask here. First of all, what is foreign policy and how is it related to domestic policy? Second thing is, who makes foreign policy and who do they make it for? Is it to benefit us? Is it to benefit somebody else? Who's it for? Third is, what determines the possibilities and the limits of foreign policy? Okay, first of all, what is foreign policy? Foreign policy refers to policy that Americans develop to deal with other countries. There are 195 countries in the world. Foreign policy is focused on external affairs. Domestic policy is what we call the policy focused on internal affairs, mostly economic policy, but also welfare programs, et cetera, et cetera. There are, as I mentioned, about 195 countries in the world. They're very unequal, these 195 countries, right? There are, break them into basically four kinds of groups of here. There are 9 countries that are called superpowers. These are countries that have nuclear weapons, which mean that they have nuclear weapons, gives them the power to destroy everything on the planet. The United States and Russia are the largest nuclear powers. Between them, they have about 13,000 nuclear warheads. China is the number 3 with about 500 nuclear warheads. The United Kingdom, France, Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea are the other superpowers. Each of these have nuclear weapons. Now, these countries vary widely. The US has got the world's largest economy. North Korea has got an economy that's not even 1% of the US economy. So having nuclear weapons doesn't mean all these 9 countries are equal to each other. There are another category of countries which are going to be thought of as great powers. These are countries that have large economies, and they may have a large military. They have influence around the world. They generally have a significant role in things like NATO or the United Nations. These are countries that may or may not have nuclear weapons. There are things like Japan or Germany who don't have nuclear weapons, Australia, Italy, Canada, Turkey, Brazil, countries like that are large countries, large populations, large militaries, large economies. And then there are medium powers, which are countries that are kind of below those great powers, generally don't have nuclear weapons or large militaries, don't have terribly large economies. Countries like Egypt or Nigeria, South Africa, Iran, Mexico, South Korea, Norway, Austria could be in that group. And then there are these small powers. These are countries that are fairly small in terms of population, don't have large militaries, sometimes have virtually no military, don't have much influence in international affairs. They're countries that are still vital to the system. Costa Rica, Senegal, Bangladesh, Paraguay, Bhutan, Honduras, Liberia, et cetera. These are countries that fall into those categories. And so foreign policy is the policy which Americans use to deal with all of these. Foreign policy dealing with a country like Russia or China is very different than foreign policy dealing with a country like Paraguay or Bhutan. The Americans want similar kind of things from all these countries, and these countries want similar kind of things from the Americans, but the relations differ widely. And the Americans and the Russians are in constant contact with each other, as are Americans and the Chinese. When's the last time the president of the United States met with the leader of Bhutan, if ever? I don't even know. Okay, so who makes foreign policy and for whom? As with domestic policy, the making of foreign policy is a complex process. It involves Congress and the president, according to the Constitution, but also the federal bureaucracy. It involves interest groups like those ones I mentioned before, voters. It includes the businesses and consumers. Now, like domestic policy, responsibility for foreign policy is divided between the executive and legislative branches. Article 2 of the Constitution says that the president is the commander-in-chief of the military, and he has the power to negotiate treaties, and he has the power to appoint and receive ambassadors to and from other countries. But Article 1 says that only Congress can actually declare war against another country, and the Senate must give its advice and consent for the ratification of treaties negotiated by the president, and has to give its advice and consent for the appointment of American ambassadors abroad. And so both of them have a role to play in foreign policy, and the idea is that they check and balance each other. As in the making of domestic policy, the role of the president has increased over time. The president has taken a more and more significant role in the making of foreign policy over the last 100 years, particularly in the area of military and conflict, war. Nowadays, since World War II, Congress has not declared war against any other country, and yet the U.S. has been involved in military conflicts with a number of countries ever since 1941. Why? This is because the American government, the American president, has the power to order troops into combat. Since 1973, the American president has to get the permission of Congress to continue that. The thing called the War Powers Act made it so that if a president commits troops to any kind of conflict around the world, and this is a recognition that sometimes the president can't wait around for Congress to debate an issue, or Congress might not be in session when there's a need to suddenly send troops someplace to deal with some kind of crisis. But within 100 days, the Congress will be back in session. So within 100 days, the president must seek approval from Congress in the form of a ratification of the exercise, and also approval to spend the money necessary to commit these troops. Okay, so what determines the kind of foreign policy? Why does the foreign policy of the United States like it is? Why is it not something else? Well, over the last 100 years, there have been four main worldviews that have shaped American foreign policy thinking, and this is among both the presidents and major leaders of Congress, but also among Americans in general. The first one the book identifies is isolationism. That is that in the early period of the 20th century, the United States didn't want to get involved in world conflicts. It didn't want to get involved in World War I and declared its neutrality when the war started. And once it did get dragged into the war in 1917, Americans committed troops until the end of the war in 1918, and then basically withdrew again. And during the 1920s and into the 30s, Americans wanted to remain isolated from European affairs and from world affairs. They didn't want to get dragged into another war. Well, the problem with that was that because the US was isolated, the world got dragged into World War II again. And that meant that in the 1940s, Americans began to realize the perils of isolationism. And so they developed a new kind of policy, which was containment. That is, to try to stop the dangers that the US confronts, like fascism and communism, to stop them before they get to our shores, before the Americans actually get attacked by Germany or Japan again, or by the Soviet Union, that the United States should get involved in forming alliances, creating allegiances, and spending military, building bases, spending money on the military, building bases, those kind of things to contain those kind of threats. So after World War II, the US gets involved in the United Nations, it gets involved in NATO, it gets involved in various kinds of alliances with other countries to fight against communism. Well, that continues until about the 60s, when the US is involved in Vietnam, and a lot of Americans began to believe that the US was over involved in the world and had policy that was out of control, that the president was doing stuff in Southeast Asia that Americans didn't want him to do. Americans wanted the war to end. People in Congress wanted the Vietnam War to end. And so in the 1970s and into the 80s, we have a period of disengagement where Americans just didn't want to get involved in a war. We'd been involved with the UN, we'd been involved with the world, but no more wars. And that continues until about 1991, when the US gets involved in another big war against Iraq, which had invaded Kuwait, in 1990. And this was seen by many people as an abandonment of the disengagement policy and what they called the Vietnam syndrome, and rather Americans beginning to get involved once again with the world. And so this becomes a period then of American engagement. But this time the focus is not on containing fascism or communism, because communism's dead. In 1991, the Soviet Union falls apart. And so Americans feel communism is no longer a threat. And so what Americans tend to focus then is on dealing with human rights and human security around the world. And that is that the US should be involved in building a new world order that is not based upon war and conflict and competition, but rather on cooperation and working with other countries to improve the lives of people. Well, keep in mind that in the 2000s, the United States starts its war on terror or terrorism after the attacks of 9/11. And this is another different kind of policy, because this is not so much geared towards human rights and human security, because during the war on terror, the US becomes one of the world's largest violators of human rights, using torture, locking up people in Guantanamo without ever charging them for crimes, and for engaging in various kind of things and supporting the various oppressive governments around the world, like Syria or Egypt, that were torturing people that Americans got them to arrest because they were suspected of terrorist activities or being enemies of the United States. Also consider that in the last few years, Donald Trump brought a new kind of vision of the United States role in the world, which could be roughly defined as populism or America first kind of a policy. Donald Trump said during his campaign in 2016 and during his presidency that the US was being screwed by the rest of the world. The US was too involved and was spending too much money helping out other countries and helping out people around the world. And the Americans should look to themselves first and make sure that any kinds of foreign policy would accrue to the benefit of the United States rather than some other country. And we should profit from our foreign policy as opposed to spending money. So those are the different kinds of views there. All right, I'm going to leave it there. Happy reading. I hope you enjoy it. If you have any questions, let me know. I'll be around this coming week, of course. My office hours on Tuesday, or if you can't meet then, let me know a good time and day for you to meet, and we'll try to get together. All right, thanks a lot. Let me know if you have any questions. Take care.